My 62nd birthday should have felt like a celebration, a small slice of gratitude for the decades I'd poured into this family. Instead, it felt like a funeral for my dignity. The dining room was full, yet I'd never felt so invisible. The long oak table, the one Martin and I had saved years to buy, was crowded with plates of roast, mashed potatoes, and cake. But there wasn't a single candle lit for me. No one even asked what kind of cake I liked. Caleb, my oldest, sat at the head of the table like he owned it. His wife, Lena, perched beside him with her perfect posture and constant hum of condescension. Ava, my youngest, had just flown in from Boston the night before. She looked tired, uncomfortable, and oddly quiet, always careful not to stir conflict. I understood that look. I wore it most of my life. Midway through dinner, Caleb raised his glass and gave a shallow toast. To Mom, 62 and still hanging in there. A few chuckles circled the table, but none of them reached my heart. I smiled politely, even as something inside me cracked. Then came Lena's voice, sharp and sugary. You know, at some point we should start helping you manage things around here. Maybe take some of the weight off your shoulders. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, Caleb added with a smirk. Yeah, you're too old to worry about all that stuff now. Just enjoy your time, Mom. We've got it handled. Silence fell like a curtain. Ava stared at her plate. My fork paused mid-air, and for a moment the clinking of cutlery was the only sound in the room. I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I just stopped. In that instant, everything slowed down. I looked around at faces I had once held in my arms, fed, soothed, and protected. I saw none of that history reflected back at me. Just entitlement, just impatience. They didn't see a mother anymore, or a woman, or a person. They saw a burden with assets. They saw a fading figure who needed to be managed and gently pushed aside, like an old photograph too dusty to display. And this wasn't sudden. It had been coming in waves. After Martin passed 3 years ago, I had clung to my routines, my sense of purpose. I stayed strong because I had to, but Caleb and Lena had slowly inserted themselves into everything. First, it was helping with the bills, then it was offering to take care of my banking. Then came suggestions to simplify the house, followed by pressure to add their names to certain documents, just in case. I thought it was love. Now I saw it was strategy. They hadn't come to support me. They had come to prepare for a transfer of power. I stood up quietly after dinner and began collecting plates. Ava offered to help, but I waved her off. I needed the silence. I needed the motion. Washing dishes was the only thing keeping my hands from trembling. I couldn't stop thinking about Martin. He used to say, "Respect isn't spoken, it's shown." And tonight, they showed me exactly how much they respected me. I dried my hands, went upstairs, and closed my bedroom door behind me like a final chapter. I didn't cry. Instead, I sat at my vanity, stared into the mirror, and asked myself a question I hadn't asked in years. What would I do if I didn't care what anyone thought? The answer came so quickly it startled me. I'd leave. Not next week. Not after a confrontation. Not after a long speech that they'd ignore anyway. I'd leave tonight, quietly, with no explanations. I still had the keys to Martin's old Buick. I still had the second set of documents Nora had helped me store in the attic. The ones with the original deed, the untouched will, and every financial record from before they interfered. I knew where they were. I knew who I could call. So I packed a single bag, just clothes, my documents, and the small framed photo of me and Martin taken on our trip to the Tetons, the last time I felt truly seen. As I walked past the dining room, I could hear Caleb and Lena laughing about something. My name didn't come up once. They didn't notice the door close behind me. They wouldn't notice until morning, and by then, I'd already be gone. The night air hit my face as I stepped outside, and for a moment, I just stood there on the porch, my fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of the suitcase, knuckles white. My breath came slow and quiet. I didn't know where I was going yet, only that I couldn't stay another second in that house where my name was spoken like a joke and my presence tolerated like dust on a shelf. There was no drama, no tears, no slam doors, just stillness. I slipped into Martin's old Buick, the one they told me to sell because it didn't match the image of the neighborhood anymore. I turned the ignition, half expecting it not to start, but it did, like it had been waiting for me all along. As I backed out of the driveway, I looked up at the second-floor window where my bedroom light still glowed. I imagined Caleb and Lena sitting inside, sipping wine, strategizing my future like I was a business deal. I pictured Ava, dear, sweet Ava, curled up on the edge of her bed, biting her tongue to avoid becoming the next target. Part of me ached for her, but the rest of me knew she had to find her own strength, just like I was finally finding mine. I didn't leave a note. What could I possibly write? Thanks for reducing me to a retirement plan. Love, Mom. Number. They didn't deserve an explanation. They had never once asked how I felt when they took over my home. They never noticed how often I went silent at dinner, how I stopped knitting, how I forgot to water the plants Martin loved. They didn't see it, or worse, they saw and didn't care. As I drove through the quiet neighborhood, every familiar corner blurred past me. The grocery store where I used to bump into old friends, the church where Martin and I renewed our vows on our 40th anniversary. All of it felt like echoes from another life, a life I had let others narrate for far too long. I pulled into a gas station on the edge of town just before midnight. I bought a cup of stale coffee and sat on a plastic bench outside, sipping slowly. There was a neon light above me, buzzing faintly, the only sound besides the distant hum of a highway. That's when it really hit me. I was alone. And not the kind of alone where someone calls after 10 minutes to check on you. No one even knew I was gone. They wouldn't look for me. They might not even notice I'd packed my documents, my ID, my credit cards, and the spare bank account Martin helped me open years ago. A quiet fund I never touched. Until now. The silence around me wasn't loud. It was pure, freeing. I thought about the years I spent holding that family together like glue. Every holiday, every crisis, every moment of chaos. I was the one who smoothed things over, made excuses, picked up the pieces, and now they treated me like some old machine, too outdated to be useful but too valuable to throw away without harvesting the parts. I had said nothing because I wanted peace. I stayed quiet because I believed, foolishly, that love would return if I just held on a little longer. But now I knew. Silence hadn't protected me. It had erased me. At that gas station, with coffee that tasted like metal and headlights zipping by on the highway, I made a decision I never thought I'd have the courage to make. I would stop being quiet. I wouldn't shout. I wouldn't beg. But I would take my life back. On my terms. I would disappear from their narrative and write my own. No more explaining, no more asking permission, just action. That night, I found a small inn an hour outside the city, a plain place with peeling paint and a kind woman at the front desk who didn't ask questions. I paid in cash. I took a hot shower. I hung the photo of Martin beside the bed lamp, and I slept with the lights off for the first time in months, because I no longer needed to keep watch over a house that had stopped being mine. The first morning I woke up at the inn, I didn't know where I was. For a second, I reached over, expecting to feel the warmth of Martin beside me, or hear the floor creak under Caleb's footsteps, or the faint clatter of Lena making her overly strong coffee in my kitchen. But there was nothing. Just the low hum of the heating vent and the muffled sound of waves breaking in the distance. It wasn't until I saw my suitcase at the foot of the bed that it all came rushing back. I had left. For the first time in my life, I had chosen myself over them. And yet, instead of relief, a strange kind of weight settled in my chest. Grief, maybe. Not for the house or even for the family as it was, but for the lie I had lived in for so long. The illusion that if I kept giving, they'd keep loving. That loyalty would be enough. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the framed photo of me and Martin. We looked so young, so hopeful. He had his arm around me, and I was laughing mid-sentence, wind blowing my hair across my face. It was taken during our trip to the Tetons, a time when we were free, before the strokes, before the home hospice bed, before our children became strangers with familiar names. I whispered, "You wouldn't have let them do this to me, Martin." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. He loved them. We both did. And that love had made us blind. The day passed slowly. I walked along the beach, the wet sand cool beneath my shoes. I watched a group of children chasing waves, their laughter slicing through the wind like music. I envied them, not for their youth, but for their ability to be present. I had spent years thinking only of the next grocery list, the next bill, the next family gathering. Never once did I stop to ask, what do I want? Now I had no excuses. But that kind of freedom doesn't come easy. It comes with guilt. The kind of guilt that plays like a loop in your mind. You're being dramatic. You abandon them. What kind of mother walks out without warning? I had spent so many years molding myself to what everyone needed that I didn't know how to sit still in my own need. But every time that guilt rose, I reminded myself of that night, of the way they had laughed, not realizing their words were cutting my soul open. Back in my room, I opened an old notebook I'd brought. It was one I used to keep in the kitchen junk drawer, half filled with grocery lists, chicken pot pie recipes, and notes about prescriptions. I flipped past all of that and found a blank page. I wrote, Day 1. I am not worthless. I am not old news. I am still here. The words weren't poetic, but they were mine. That night, I dreamt I was standing in my own house, surrounded by boxes. My children were there, but they didn't look at me. They moved around me like I was furniture. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. When I woke up, my hands were clenched so tightly around the blanket that my knuckles ached. I realized then that I hadn't just walked away from them. I had walked away from the version of myself who had accepted invisibility as a fact of life. That woman, the one who smiled politely as her power was stripped away, she was gone now. And it wasn't just about Caleb or Lena or anyone else. It was about what I had allowed. The innkeeper, a soft-spoken woman named Joy, knocked gently that morning and asked if I needed fresh towels. I thanked her, and she smiled kindly. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked. "No," I said. "I'm just starting over." She nodded, not pressing. Well, everyone deserves a fresh start. Her words stayed with me. For the first time in a long time, someone spoke to me like I mattered, like I wasn't an afterthought. That night, I wrote again, Day 2. I am grieving, but I am also rebuilding, slowly, quietly, brick by brick. And just like that, a new kind of life began, not loud or bold, but mine. It was on the 4th morning, just after my walk along the shoreline, that I felt the urge to do more than reflect. Sitting still in grief had served a purpose. It cleared the noise, revealed the rot. But now something sharper stirred inside me. Suspicion. Not just about how they spoke to me that night, but about what they had already done in the months leading up to it. I pulled out my old leather file pouch from the bottom of my suitcase. It contained everything I hadn't trusted to digital space. The original copy of my will, bank statements, insurance policies, even the deed to the house Martin and I bought together. I had kept those documents in a locked drawer in the upstairs hallway, never imagining I'd need to check if they'd been tampered with. But now, I wasn't so sure. I called Nora Bell that afternoon. Nora had been my friend since college, long before I became mom and grandma. She was also one of the few people I trusted implicitly. When Martin passed, she was the one who guided me through the estate process. She didn't ask questions when I told her I needed to talk, just gave me a time and address. Driving into the city to see her felt like stepping into another life. Her office hadn't changed much, still filled with dusty law books and photos of her kids, who were now all grown and thriving. She pulled me into a hug before I even sat down. "You okay?" she asked gently. I hesitated. Not really, but I will be. Once I laid out everything that had happened, from Caleb's smug remarks to Lena's growing control over the house, Nora grew quiet. Then she began pulling up files, logging into secured databases, reviewing shared access to all the accounts Martin and I had set up. It didn't take long. Some accounts had been accessed from IP addresses I didn't recognize. One from Caleb's office. The will? A newer version had been quietly drafted by another attorney and filed without my full review. It named Caleb as executor, Lena as secondary. Ava was barely mentioned. My medical directive had been revised too. Fewer options, less independence. "This isn't just overreach," Nora said. "This is planned. They were preparing to take full control." I felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't paranoia. It was real. While I had been playing grandmother and hostess, they had been building a case that I was no longer capable of managing my life. I thought back to the subtle manipulations. Lena offering to help organize my prescriptions, Caleb insisting on being present during my doctor visits, Ava being told to let mom rest instead of discussing finances with me. None of it felt like love anymore. It felt like strategy. And there was one more thing. Nora asked me if I remembered an old joint investment Martin had opened for us in the early 2000s. I did. A modest but steady stock fund meant for our retirement travels. I hadn't touched it since his death, assuming it had simply rolled into my other accounts. Turns out Caleb had recently submitted paperwork to have it dissolved, citing power of attorney I had never granted. I sat back in the chair, stunned. For years, I had given everything: time, money, affection, patience, and they had been quietly siphoning off what was left. "They think you're gone," Nora said. "They think you've surrendered." But I hadn't. I wasn't broken. I was bruised, and now wide awake. Nora helped me gather everything. We rescinded any previous power of attorney claims, froze unnecessary accounts, opened new ones. She drafted an updated will and ensured every decision I made was documented, clearly, legally, and without interference. But I didn't stop there. Back at the inn, I made another list. Not of groceries or chores, but of memories. Each one was a breadcrumb that led me to this realization. The time Lena had insisted I stop using the oven because it wasn't safe. The way Caleb moved my mail into his hands before I ever saw it. The look on Ava's face when she realized her opinion didn't matter at that table. These weren't isolated events. They were symptoms of something deeper. A family that had stopped seeing me as human the moment they smelled control. But I wasn't powerless. Not anymore. And now I had proof. I had Nora. And I had a new purpose. Not just to reclaim what was mine, but to decide what legacy I wanted to leave behind. Not the one they were drafting behind my back, the one I would write with my own hands. It's a strange thing. The moment you stop asking to be understood and instead decide to act, that shift inside me didn't come with fireworks or anger. It came like breath after being underwater too long. Quiet. Sure. Steady. Nora and I sat in her office for hours that week, going over every paper trail. She laid everything out like a chessboard, explaining where I had power and where they had overstepped. I hadn't just come to her as a grieving mother. I came as a woman ready to reclaim her agency. I wasn't just looking for defense anymore. I wanted clarity, protection, and a long-term plan. "The key," Nora said, tapping her pen on the folder, "is to stop reacting. Let them keep thinking you've disappeared. That's your strength right now." So we did just that. Together, we crafted a new will, one that protected my assets and clearly removed Caleb and Lena from any position of authority or inheritance. Instead, I established a trust in Martin's name, something we'd once discussed but never implemented, a foundation to support women over 50 who were rebuilding their lives after abandonment, neglect, or abuse. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent my whole life giving to a husband, to children, to friends. And now, in this unexpected chapter, I was still giving. But this time, I was choosing who deserved it. I also reclaimed the house. Legally, the deed had always been in my name. Martin and I had paid for it together with no co-signers. But Nora helped me file papers transferring ownership into a living trust. That meant even if Caleb tried anything again, he'd hit a wall. The house would never be his. The walls he tried to silence me in would never be his trophy. After the legal work was in motion, Nora leaned back and said, "You've done more in 3 weeks than most people do in a year." I smiled faintly. I've waited decades. I'm just catching up. Still, there was one loose thread I hadn't tugged at yet. Ava. Out of everyone, she had been the only one who hadn't played a role in the takeover. She stayed quiet. She didn't defend me that night at the dinner table, but she didn't join in either, and that silence, her silence, haunted me more than Caleb's smug voice or Lena's veiled insults. I drafted a letter. I didn't want to risk a call. I didn't know who had access to her phone or if she was being watched, so I wrote by hand on the stationery Martin had gifted me years ago. Ava, I know you've wondered where I went. I need you to understand that I didn't leave you. I left a house that no longer saw me as a person. I love you. I always have. But I couldn't stay where I wasn't safe. I hope one day you'll understand that silence can be survival. And I hope when you're ready, you'll remember where to find me. Love. Mom, I didn't include a return address, but I knew that if Ava wanted to find me, she could reach Nora. That was enough. With every box checked, every document signed, I felt lighter. Not because I had won anything, but because I had chosen to stop being collateral in my own life. And as I sat alone in the inn's sunroom, watching the wind rustle the tall grass outside the window, I realized something else. This wasn't revenge. This was reclamation. I wasn't doing this to hurt Caleb or Lena. I was doing it to finally protect myself. Something I should have done long ago. Nora called a few days later with good news. Everything's finalized, she said. The trust is in place. The accounts are secure. You're free to do whatever you want. And just like that, I was. I walked out to the beach that night, barefoot in the sand. The sky was a deep violet, the waves gentle. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Martin." I didn't know exactly what I was thanking him for. Maybe for the years we had, maybe for the strength I found alone, maybe just for believing I could be more than someone else's shadow. This was the turning point, the pivot from pain to purpose. They may have seen an old woman, but what I saw in the mirror now was someone new, someone they'd never see coming. Once the legal groundwork was in place, a new chapter began, one that required the hardest skill I'd ever had to master: patience. I wasn't just walking away from the people who hurt me. I was walking through a carefully constructed illusion they had built, an illusion that painted them as the protectors and me as the fragile matriarch needing direction. They still believed I was weak, and I let them believe it. That was my greatest strength now, their arrogance. I returned to the quiet town where I'd been staying, no longer a grieving woman hiding in an inn, but a strategist preparing to rewrite the final act of her story. I rented a small seaside cottage. It had peeling white shutters, a porch that creaked, and a view of the water that calmed the tremors in my soul. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. I decorated it with pieces from my past. A quilt Martin and I had bought in Tennessee, a wind chime Ava made in 3rd grade, a hand-carved jewelry box from my grandmother. These were things Lena had said were clutter, things she tried to box up without asking. I unboxed them slowly, placing each one with intention. Every object became a rebellion. Every photo, every recipe card, a declaration: I am not disposable. While they thought I had vanished, I was building something stronger than revenge. I was building freedom. I met with Nora weekly, sometimes by phone, sometimes in person. We spoke in codes. She referred to my estate as the project. The trust was the garden. My will was the manuscript. It made us feel like two women editing a story no one else knew existed. We monitored Caleb's attempts to access frozen accounts. We noted how Lena had tried to reach out to the bank under my name. Each failure tightened the net. I kept every letter Nora mailed me, locking them in a small fireproof box in my closet. Not out of fear, but readiness. They would never see it coming, because they thought I was gone, because they never believed I had it in me to protect myself. I started documenting everything: memories, details, conversations from before I left, not just to protect myself, but because the act of writing gave me clarity. I filled notebooks with what I now saw in hindsight, moments when I had been diminished, cut off, rewritten. Like when Caleb interrupted me during Martin's eulogy to read his own speech, one I hadn't been shown beforehand, or when Lena took over the planning of Ava's baby shower saying, "Mom gets too overwhelmed now." It hadn't been one blow. It had been 1,000 paper cuts, and for a while I had mistaken them for love. But love doesn't erase you. So I stopped reaching out. I changed my phone number. I closed my email. I didn't owe anyone access to me. Not anymore. I notified the post office and rerouted my mail to Nora's office. Anything urgent would be filtered. Everything else could wait. The days grew quieter. I planted herbs in small pots along the kitchen windowsill: rosemary, thyme, and mint. I started walking in the mornings, waving at the neighbors who didn't ask questions. I learned the name of the woman at the market who always saved me the ripest peaches. Her name was Carol. She was 67, widowed, and fierce as hell. We became fast friends. One afternoon, while sipping coffee on my porch, Carol asked, "So what's your story?" I smiled. "Let's just say I used to live in a house full of noise, and now I don't." She nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. By the end of the 3rd month, I had found rhythm in the silence, the kind that didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. Then came Ava's letter. It arrived at Nora's office, handwritten. Nora forwarded it to me. It was short. "Mom, I don't know where you are, but I think I finally understand why you left. I miss you. I'm sorry. Love, Ava." I held the letter to my chest and cried for the first time since I left. Not because of pain, but because someone had finally seen me, not as a duty, not as an obstacle, but as a person. I didn't write back. Not yet. I needed more time, because the final piece of my plan, the one they never saw coming, was still in motion. And when it arrived, it wouldn't come with drama. It would come with silence, and the sound of everything falling exactly into place. The day I filed the final paperwork, it was raining softly. Not the heavy kind that drenches you, but the quiet drizzle that makes everything feel suspended. Like the world is pausing to pay attention. It felt right. This wasn't a storm. It was a shift. The Martin Hale Foundation for Women Over 50 became official that afternoon. The ink dried on the legal documents. The trust had been transferred, and the opening ceremony was scheduled. Every detail had been planned, not out of bitterness, but precision. Caleb and Lena had taken so much from me, in whispers and nudges, in looks and paperwork. I would deliver my answer, not in anger, but in legacy. Nora and I worked for weeks finalizing the details. The foundation would provide emergency funds, career guidance, and small grants for women starting over after abandonment or neglect. Women like me who had been told they were too old to matter. I chose a modest but elegant venue by the waterfront. It was the kind of place Martin would have loved. Simple wood floors, high ceilings, natural light pouring in. I could almost hear him say, "You finally made something for yourself." Once everything was set, it was time for the final move. I mailed the invitations. One went to Caleb and Lena, another to Ava, and one, with shaky hands, I sent to my brother Theo, the only person from my family who had ever called just to ask how I was. Theo had always stayed out of the drama. He had raised 2 boys, worked as a mechanic, and kept his life simple. But he never forgot my birthday, and when Martin died, he was the one who came to sit with me for hours. No words needed. I knew he'd come. The invitation wasn't flashy, just cream cardstock, gold trim, and a simple message. You are invited to the launch of the Martin Hale Foundation in honor of dignity, strength, and new beginnings. Time, date, and venue followed. No return address. For Caleb and Lena, I knew curiosity would bring them. They hated not knowing. They hated being left out. I could already imagine Lena's reaction. First confusion, then suspicion, then control disguised as concern. A foundation? Since when? Who's behind this? And I could picture Caleb brushing it off, trying to laugh, but unable to hide the itch of being left out. The son who thought he had won would now sit outside a door he could no longer open. I rehearsed nothing. I didn't need to. The trap had already been set the moment I left that house. This event was just the unveiling, the clean, graceful stroke that revealed the full painting. When the day arrived, I wore a dark blue dress Martin had bought me a decade earlier. Lena once said it was a bit too old-fashioned. I wore it like armor. The room filled quickly. Women from the community came. Some I'd mentored over the last few months, others I hadn't met, but who had heard whispers of what this foundation stood for. Reporters from the local paper were there. Theo showed up early and brought me coffee like always. He didn't ask questions. He just hugged me and said, "About time." At 11 a.m. sharp, Caleb and Lena walked in. Caleb wore his smugness like a tie. Lena looked around like she owned the place. Ava trailed behind, unsure, eyes wide, holding her purse like a shield. She looked thinner, tired. But something about her posture had changed. She looked less polished, more real. I stepped up to the podium, heart steady, voice clear. "Good morning," I began. "When my husband Martin passed, I lost more than a partner. I lost the balance in my home. And slowly, without realizing it, I began to lose myself. But this past year gave me something I didn't expect, a second life. This foundation is for the women who've been told they're done, who've been forgotten, overlooked, or quietly erased. We're not done. We're just getting started." I saw Lena stiffen. Caleb whispered something in her ear. Ava's eyes welled with tears. I didn't mention them, not once. Because this wasn't about them. This was about the life they tried to strip from me, and the one I reclaimed on my own terms. And in that moment, without confrontation or revenge, I realized something powerful. And the real trap wasn't legal. It was visibility. I had made myself invisible to them, long enough to become unmovable. The moment the speech ended, I stepped down from the podium and made my way through the crowd. Women approached me with handshakes and tearful hugs, thanking me for starting something they wished had existed years ago. The warmth, the solidarity, the recognition. It was overwhelming in the best way. For the first time in years, I felt seen by people who understood what it meant to be quietly dismissed, subtly erased. But even as I greeted them, I could feel Caleb's eyes on me like a needle through fabric. He wasn't used to being sidelined, especially not by me. 10 minutes after the ceremony ended, he cornered me outside near the small rose garden behind the venue. The foundation banner waved gently behind us. The sun had broken through the clouds. A few attendees lingered nearby, but Caleb made sure to keep his voice low enough not to draw attention. "You've been planning this the whole time, haven't you?" he said, crossing his arms. His jaw was clenched, his tone quiet but boiling. All this silence, the disappearing act, What, was this some kind of revenge stunt? I looked at him, really looked at him. Still handsome, still put together, but suddenly small. For all his confidence, he didn't have any real answers, just ego, just fear that he'd lost control. I planned this the moment you told me I didn't matter anymore, I said evenly. And it wasn't revenge, Caleb. It was clarity. He stepped closer, his voice hardening. You changed the will. Nora won't talk to me. The accounts are frozen. What the hell, Mom? We were trying to help you. No, I said, my voice calm but sharp. You were trying to manage me. There's a difference. I was the one stepping up when you were falling apart. Was I falling apart, or were you hoping I would? I asked. He didn't respond. Lena came around the corner just then, her heels clicking furiously on the pavement. Caleb, she hissed, we should go. This is humiliating. She looked at me, her eyes cold. You blindsided us. After everything we've done. What you've done, I said, was slowly remove me from my own life. She scoffed. We were trying to protect your assets. You don't understand how things work anymore. No, I said, folding my hands in front of me. You assumed I didn't understand because I stopped pushing back. That's not the same thing as ignorance. That's endurance. Ava appeared next. She didn't speak right away. She just stood beside me, arms crossed tightly over her chest, staring at Caleb and Lena. She looked like she wanted to shrink and explode at the same time. You both should leave, Ava said finally, her voice trembling but steady. This isn't about you. Caleb turned to her in disbelief. Seriously? You're taking her side now? I was always on her side, Ava said. I was just scared. There was silence, heavy and ripe. Lena shook her head and walked off, muttering something under her breath. Caleb lingered, staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Not as his mother, but as a woman he couldn't manipulate. You're not the same person, he said quietly. No, I replied. I finally stopped letting you define who I am. With that, he turned and followed his wife. Ava stayed behind. I looked at her and gave a small nod. You don't have to explain anything. She shook her head. I'm not going back with them. I didn't expect you to choose sides. I'm not, she said, eyes brimming. I'm choosing peace. We walked back into the venue together. No grand declarations, no applause. Just the gentle hum of women finding seats, sipping coffee and flipping through program booklets that told stories like mine. And theirs. That was the showdown. No screaming, no threats. Just truth, standing on its own legs, finally unafraid to be heard. In that moment, I felt something loosen deep in my chest. The kind of release that only comes when you no longer need to be right. You just need to be free. I had taken back my story, and they could either accept that or get out of the way. The days after the launch event passed like the tide, calm, deliberate, and healing. No more tension in my chest. No more waiting for the phone to ring with questions I didn't want to answer or accusations I didn't deserve. Just space. Room to breathe. I woke each morning to sunlight pouring in through gauzy curtains and the smell of rosemary from the kitchen windowsill. The cottage had become a sanctuary, not just in its quiet, but in its honesty. Everything inside it was mine, not just by ownership, but by intention. There was no pretense, no manipulation, no power games. And for the first time in decades, I didn't have to perform as someone's mother, grandmother, gatekeeper, or emotional anchor. I was simply Ruth again, a woman with a voice, a woman who had been underestimated, overlooked, but not erased. Theo came by often, sometimes bringing fresh bread from the farmer's market, sometimes nothing but stories from his garage and coffee. He never pressed me for updates, never tried to fix anything. He just showed up. And after so many years of feeling invisible, that quiet consistency felt like a kind of miracle. Ava visited too, a little awkward at first, unsure of where we stood. She brought a potted violet on her first trip, cheeks pink with uncertainty. I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me, she said, her eyes scanning the room for some hint of judgment. I hugged her tightly. You never had to choose between us, Ava. You just needed time. I understand that now. She cried in my arms that day and again the next week when she told me she'd moved out of Caleb and Lena's house. I stayed quiet too long, she said. I thought silence kept the peace, but it just made the war quieter. We sat on the porch that evening, watching the ocean breathe in and out, and I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Trust. Not in other people, in myself. Meanwhile, Caleb and Lena stayed silent. They never reached out. No threats, no apologies, just the slow, inevitable sinking that comes when a tower of control loses its foundation. I imagine they spent weeks trying to unravel the pieces, making calls, checking balances, waiting for a loophole to reveal itself. But there were none. The accounts had been locked, the property placed in a trust they couldn't touch, the will legally validated and secured with Nora. The foundation, publicly launched and thriving, was irrevocable. They couldn't undo it, and they knew it. I didn't need to gloat. My absence from their narrative was its own power. I had always been their fallback, the one who cleaned up, smoothed over, made peace. Once I stepped out of that role, they had nothing to pivot off of. They had written me off as old, soft, pliable, and now I was granite. But I didn't spend my days thinking about what they lost. I spent them thinking about what I gained. I mentored 2 women from the foundation, Gloria, a 58-year-old who left a financially abusive marriage, and Dana, 61, who was starting a candle-making business after being laid off. We met every Thursday in the community space, trading stories, recipes, laughter, and strategy. I saw pieces of myself in both of them. The hesitation, the flicker of doubt, the slow return of purpose. One afternoon, Gloria said, "I used to think my story was over, that I was just surviving until the end. But now it feels like I just turned the page to the best chapter." That stayed with me, because I had felt the same. My quiet victory didn't come with a parade. It came in the way I could walk into my own kitchen without flinching, in the way I could sleep with the doors unlocked, in the way I laughed, belly deep and unguarded, without bracing for the judgment I used to feel in my own home. This wasn't the life they planned for me. It was the life I built when they weren't looking, not for revenge, for peace. And I had found it. Not in isolation, but in truth. Not in shouting, but in stillness. Not by clinging to what I was owed, but by stepping fully into what I deserved. It was a Sunday morning when I finally exhaled, the kind of exhale that comes from deep within your bones, the kind you don't know you've been holding until it leaves you. The sky was pale and clear, the waves just beginning to rise, soft and rhythmic like breath. I sat on the wooden bench near the edge of the bluff behind my cottage, the same one Martin used to dream of owning during our long road trips. On my lap sat the Foundation's first official award plaque, a simple gold-rimmed rectangle engraved with both of our names, the Martin and Ruth Hale Award for New Beginnings. The woman who had received it, Gloria, had stood on stage last week with shaking hands, tears rolling down her face, saying she never believed someone would see her again after 50. That was the moment I had waited for. Not Caleb's regret, not Lena's silence, but this. A woman finding herself after a lifetime of being dismissed, a stranger reclaiming the space the world had slowly stolen from her. And I realized then, the victory was never about proving my worth to those who doubted me. It was about becoming someone I respected again. I ran my fingers over the plaque as the ocean breeze caught my hair. I could almost hear Martin's voice beside me, low and warm. "You did it, Ruth. You made something out of the ashes." And I had. They said I was too old to matter. They said it like a closing argument. But it was never the end. It was a beginning disguised as rejection. The truth is, they didn't break me. They revealed me. They made the mistake of underestimating the woman who raised them, comforted them, cleaned up after their messes, and stood between them and the consequences of their own coldness. They thought I was fading, but I was evolving, becoming sharper, quieter, stronger. I thought about Caleb. I hadn't heard from him since the day of the foundation launch. No calls, no apologies, just absence. The kind that speaks volumes. At first, I thought I wanted a confrontation, a reckoning. But now, I didn't need his words. I had outgrown his approval. The version of me that begged to be heard at that birthday dinner no longer existed. Lena, as expected, disappeared completely. She was never interested in family, just in power. Without access to the estate or my accounts, she had no reason to pretend. And Ava, sweet, hesitant Ava, she was finding her own way now. We didn't talk about the past much. We didn't need to. She came by often, sometimes staying the night. She helped with foundation events and brought me books she thought I'd love. We healed through small kindnesses, through honesty, through time. A week ago, she asked me quietly, "Mom, are you angry at me?" I looked her in the eyes. I was never angry. I was just hurt. She nodded and didn't say more. That was enough. I have learned that forgiveness doesn't always come in one piece. Sometimes it's slow, layered, like tide smoothing a jagged stone. It doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing not to carry the weight any longer. And so, I let go. I let go of needing to be the fixer, the forgiver, the quiet one. I let go of trying to keep a family together that never truly valued me as whole. And in letting go, I found something I never had before, peace that didn't require explanation. That morning, on the bluff, I took a photo of the ocean and the plaque and sent it to Nora with the caption, "We did it." She replied instantly, "You did it, and they'll never know how much they lost." But that's the thing. They never had me. Not the real me. Only the version they shaped with their needs and expectations. Now I belong to myself. I walked back to the house slowly, the air warm on my skin, the world unchanged yet entirely new. Inside, the kettle whistled. The scent of lemon and mint filled the kitchen. And somewhere in the other room, a breeze lifted the edge of Ava's violet plant, making its leaves dance like they were clapping. That was my ending. Not in confrontation, not in fury, but in grace, in purpose, and in the quiet certainty that I had mattered all along. Even when they couldn't see it,